A lot of people have wondered if right now could be a turning point in the long struggle for racial justice. But how many people think racism is even a problem? According to a VPR Vermont PBS poll from July, 24% of Vermonters think racism is a big problem in Vermont. 35% say it's somewhat of a problem. 25% call it a small problem. And 15% say it's not a problem at all. The numbers are still relatively low, but many Americans are looking inward, exploring their own attitudes around a tough subject, asking, am I a racist? Here's NBC5's Stuart Ledbetter.
So for me, this is justice. For me, it takes this for people to listen.
George Floyd's death prompted an outpouring.
We must demand change. Black Lives Matter.
Of grief and anger. But surely we aren't racist, not in a state that's 94% white, but which has long valued tolerance.
Yes, racism is alive and well in Vermont as it is in other parts of the country.
Curtis Reed leads the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity in Brattleboro.
There's this false notion that because there are fewer black and brown people in Vermont, that that racism is not as prevalent.
Don't believe it?
USA! USA!
Well, watch what happened during a pro-police rally in front of the state capitol, when Black Lives Matter supporters mixed with a woman who takes a different view.
Black lives don't matter at all to me. White lives matter. You've had everything.
The exchange, captured on a cell phone, quickly went viral.
I would hope that the rest of the country doesn't believe we're all represented by the woman on the video. But we have to acknowledge that racism exists here in Vermont, and that was an example of it.
Vermont, the governor said, has work to do.
It might not be as...
Kevin Christie knows what racial bias feels like.
As broad as it was in the 70s when I got here, but it still exists.
Christie, who represents the town of Hartford in the House of Representatives, has been a coach, principal, chair of his local school board, and now heads Vermont's Human Rights Commission. But when he walks into some stores in the community...
I know when eyes are on me, and there's kind of a feeling of discomfort, there.
This happens to you.
Oh, yeah.
Some cashiers, even today, won't look him in the eye.
Do white Vermonters realize there's a problem?
I'll be candid and say some do and some don't. And that's not a blinders thing. I think it's a question of doesn't happen to me.
The data suggests there's continuing bias in areas like rental housing, police traffic stops, and in the criminal justice system. And racial discrimination complaints filed with the Human Rights Commission have tripled in the last couple of years.
A lot of times people like to boil it down to terms of, am I a racist or are we racist here? And I'm not sure that that's the most constructive way to look at it. I would prefer if instead people would look at it as, how much racism do I tolerate in my day-to-day life?
To the governor, it's no longer enough to say, I'm not a racist. Now, one must be actively anti-racist. And there is some evidence people of color are finding new allies in the cause.
Does this feel like a turning point?
In many ways it does. And it's a turning point because we see more white people out in the streets, advocating for change.
Tonight, we're taking a closer look at how the mental health of different groups of Americans has changed over the last several weeks of racial unrest in our country, and how to talk with your kids about it. Dr. Jane Oketch is a professor of education and group psychotherapy at the University of Vermont, and she is the first to tell you it isn't easy.
I think the primary group that has been impacted by the death of George Floyd and the racial unrest that has gone on in the country is the African American or Black community. I think the images of Black bodies on the street and the video of George Floyd literally dying as we watch him has had a significant impact, a great deal of anxiety and fear.
It took Dr. Jane Oketch a long time to watch the video of George Floyd's last minutes of life.
I finally did it, especially as I was prepared to speak to you. I gathered the courage to watch it, and it was as awful as I had imagined it would be.
Pointing to new data collected by the Census Bureau showing Oketch has a lot of company. Black Americans reporting a clear spike in anxiety, even depression, after all of the recent unrest coming on top of the pandemic. White Americans reporting far less impact.
In my case, that's what I've thought about, is that could this happen to my child? And that creates a great deal of fear and anxiety. Even when driving, I was at UVM this morning and driving home and I saw a police car and I just feel my heart skip a beat. I've done nothing wrong, but there's just what the police begin to symbolize from watching this violent act by a police person in Minneapolis that led to the death of George Floyd. So I would encourage people not to watch it over and over again, not to look at those pictures over and over again.
The professor of education at UVM with expertise in clinical psychotherapy is also the mother of a 5-year-old boy. She said it's important now to have conversations with your kids and validate their concerns.
I've had conversations with my 5-year-old that I never imagined I would have at this point. I thought I still had time, but it was just questions of why are people demonstrating? Why is everybody so sad? Are all police bad people? I was taking a walk by a graveyard in Essex, and my son asked me if all those dead people in the graveyard had been shot by the police. So children are very young. They don't have the language to understand it. So exposing them to images that they might not be able to explain what it means could actually do more harm. It suddenly helps to have conversations with children, to help explain in an age-appropriate way what's happening in the country right now.
I wonder if the groundswell in public support for change that we are seeing across the country suggests that that all of us, including Black Americans, should feel more hopeful about this moment in history.
When I went for a Black Lives Matter rally in Essex town where I live with my son and looked at all these people who had come here after work to spend about an hour or so, at Five Corners, just shouting for peace and for racial justice. And we all wrapped up on our knees for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I was overwhelmed with a feeling of hope. This was predominantly white group of people here, but there was, I think, maybe 200 or so of us there. And I think going into it, we don't demonstrate if there is no hope that there will be an outcome from that demonstration that would benefit our community. And we're already beginning to see the benefits. The fact that different community states are having conversations about resources within our communities, funding for the police, measures that the police use to restrain individuals under arrest or under suspicion. The fact that these conversations are taking place and action is already taking place means that there is hope.
South Burlington's police chief has asked for help from Vermont State Police to do a training with his staff to help them better understand our nation's history with racism. He says that's key before we as a country can move forward. We were allowed into part of it and asked to not directly identify the staff in the room. The doctor who led the discussion says none of the officers are to blame for whatever they see in history, but we are all responsible for it.
There are no answers really today.
South Burlington Police Chief Sean Burke stands in front of a room of nearly 30 officers and staff for a training like they've never experienced before.
This whole program is really aimed at just kind of getting you thinking about systemic racism, getting you thinking about how that intersects with our profession.
He's taking the lead from Vermont State Police.
Whatever you see historically, there is not one person in this room who is to blame for it.
And Dr. Eitan Nasreddin-Longo. He's handled an implicit bias training with state police for nearly a decade, but this is the first time he's presenting to a municipal police department. It's meant to help officers confront a history of unfair policing against communities of color.
And what I want to do is talk about stories.
One that's still reverberating around the world now, that of George Floyd. While this tragedy is its own story with its own intricacies, Nasreddin-Longo says it highlights a repetition.
And that's the problem.
when you cut on your local news at night, you see black men being paraded across the screen in handcuffs.
The problems explored in the popular Netflix documentary 13th. The group watches it and breaks it down after. The film details how the prison system has been used to oppress black and brown Americans. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery.
There's a loophole.
Except for criminals.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
Having people really take an honest look at that and just accept it for what it is really important.
Stephanie Clark is a Vermont Law School professor and the director of the Center for Justice Reform. She says how these programs transition to day-to-day policing is tough to figure out.
Officers are trying to do what's right and fair by every person that they meet. But I think if you put them in circumstances where they're reacting on just impulse, how do you then take the training that they had a month ago and turn that into a different behavior in a moment?
No justice, no peace. Defund the police.
In this historic moment, cities and towns in our region are looking at succinct changes to law enforcement. Burlington will cut its uniformed officers by 30%. Plattsburgh and Barrie have created civilian oversight boards to review police department policies.
A police organization needs to understand the history of policing in this country and race before we can move forward.
Chief Burke says in his 26 years of policing and training, many historical contexts of race have been glazed over. He's committed his department to do better, calling this training a start. Dr. Nazareth Longo would say the same.
People need to slow down and not expect utopia in 20 minutes. It's a slow process. It's a slow process, and what's going to win it is everybody being committed to the long haul. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Berg says he thinks this program should be taught in police academies. VSP Major Gary Scott says he hopes to bring this to more local departments.
Across the country, communities are grappling with issues of race and discrimination. In the Northeast Kingdom, one of the only black men in his community says a new mural is making him fear for the safety of himself and his family. NBC5's Ross Ketchke has that story tonight.
For the first time in 8.5 years since we got here, we're scared.
For years, the town of Craftsbury has been the only place Andrew Horstman and his family have felt safe as people of color living in Vermont. But he says ever since a Black Lives Matter mural was painted near the town common, that feeling of a welcoming community has changed.
There's a lot of good people that have been divided. Most of them are unheard.
The town says the painting, which was created by private citizens and not commissioned by the local select board, has become a focal point of racial tension. Someone vandalizing it just a few weeks ago, leaving tire tracks across the words.
Obviously, somebody doesn't like this here.
Horstman says that he sympathizes with the recent nationwide protests and that he's been the target of racial attacks in the past, but now worries that same hatred may soon be directed at his family, some of the only black community members in the area.
Prime example, I hear that car and I tense up because I'm waiting to get shot in the back. That wasn't here 3 months ago.
The neighbors who created the mural couldn't be reached for comment. Horstman says that his repeated requests to have it removed haven't gone anywhere.
It's almost like drowning, screaming and screaming, and they're just watching from the shore.
Earlier this month, the town created a new committee to look at issues of race and discrimination in the community, including exactly what to do with the mural. But Horstman says he feels it would be better off for everyone if it were just taken down.
If you care about my family, if you care about this village, I'm begging you, please remove this.
In Craftsbury, Ross Ketchke, NBC5 News.
In Project Community tonight, right now in our country, with political and racial strife on top of the pandemic, it seems that social media may be even more of a toxic stomping ground than ever before. NBC5's Tom Garris shows us how people in our region are managing the madness that can overrun local Facebook groups.
Inside Harry Styles' salon in Milton, you'll be greeted by Brandy Edwards' infectious laugh. But it's the new greeting outside that's been turning heads.
It's just getting out of control.
It's really a sign of the times. Don't enter if you have signs of COVID-19 or racism.
There's been a lot of hateful stuff,
in town, people spewing hate, and I'm just finally sick of it.
She says she's taken a stand against downright nasty speech. What she's seeing is largely online, especially in Facebook groups. In a Milton page, someone posts this transphobic meme. In Colchester, a man bashes a school district decision to fly the Black Lives Matter flag using multiple vulgarities.
I don't know what it is about the timing right now, but I just feel like people are just becoming keyboard warriors, is what a lot of us say.
Obviously, the current political climate is a factor, I think. The other is the pandemic.
Dr. Roz Whitaker-Heck is a communications professor at Champlain College. She says people have always been emboldened online and maybe a little more reserved in expressing offensive views in person. When it comes to online groups, she says the heads, the moderators, need to step up.
List all of the norms, all of the rules, all of the expectations, and pin it or post it so it stays prominent and doesn't get lost, and make it clear to users that violations will result in either a warning or an outright removal or blocking.
As long as you're being fun about food, we'll leave it on there because, you know, it breaks it up a little bit.
Misty Greeno moderates one of the most popular Facebook groups in Vermont, To Go Tour. She, her husband, and a friend started it earlier this year. It connects people who want to eat out with open restaurants. About 5 months in, it's got 19,000 members and counting.
And it can be consuming in your life, you know, and it takes over. That's hard.
Greeno says the admins are monitoring posts constantly, removing ones that don't fit the build of the group. She says she hasn't seen too many posts spreading hate, but controversy over moderators taking down a post that called out a restaurant owner for alleged racist, repeated incidents nearly led to the end of the group. Greeno says that post violated community rules. She was attacked and called racist herself.
I almost shut the whole thing down because it hurt me so bad. I have a son of color, and I just couldn't believe that people would just make that assumption about me and not even know who I am.
Back in Milton, Edwards has her daughter Jada in the chair. She's recently been the target of aggressive, racist incidents. She blames it on ignorance and defends the Black Lives Matter movement, comparing it to a car.
If one tire popped, you can't fix all of them, you just gotta fix that one tire.
For Brandy, it feels like all of this is ramping up.
We have to meet in the middle. We have to figure this out. We can't keep going on like that.
And here at her salon, love comes first. In Milton, Tom Garris, NBC5 News.
50 years after the passage of the National Fair Housing Act, big disparities remain in home ownership across the nation and here at home. The new numbers from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency tell the story. 72% of Vermont's white households own their own homes, about the same as the national average. But among Vermont's black households, the number is only 21%, about half the national average. Maura Collins at VHFA calls that alarming.
And that gap in homeownership access is really limiting to non-whites, to blacks. And that rate that we found makes we're worse than the U.S. average. And we are worse off in Vermont than we were in 1970. And to a housing person, that is startling because it was 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And so at that point, 38% of blacks own their homes in Vermont, and now it's only 21%.
She says it's a complex problem with no one explanation. She said black households, which tended to have lower incomes, remained renters over the years and missed a big opportunity.
They lost out on a tremendous amount of wealth accumulation that white households were able to achieve. And when whites were able to own homes, post-World War II, there was a huge building boom. We can see it across our state even. A lot of modest, affordable homes were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And as those homes doubled, tripled in value, those white households who own those homes were able to turn that equity into buying more property, bigger homes, maybe invest in their children's higher education.
Fast forward to 2020, Collins said. Closing the race gap in home ownership will require a lot of things: financing support, federal help, and communities willing to build.
So when excessive zoning restrictions, such as large lot sizes and things like that, that drives up development costs, and those costs are passed on to owners and renters.
And she hopes new leaders in Washington might make affordable housing the priority it used to be.
Vermont has a lot to be proud of in terms of how much it's been able to try to fill that gap, but it is insurmountable. And so, yes, the federal government needs to support affordable housing more and do it not just in creating more apartments, but also in fair housing practices, which have been gutted recently. There's used to be a lot more testing in Vermont where households, we would see the racial discrimination that still existed in Vermont because nonprofits would get grants from the federal government to have paired testers go and try to rent apartments or get home loans. And that funding to provide for that kind of testing has also been cut. So it is across the board that we need to look at all the solutions, homeownership assistance, rental assistance, as well as homeless supports to make sure that Vermonters can be affordably and adequately housed.
Stuart Ledbetter, NBC5 News.
Some of Vermont's black leaders agree with the home ownership gap stems from several factors, but the widening gap between wages and housing costs is number one, especially in Chittenden County, the most expensive county in the state to buy a home.
Opportunities for advancement in Vermont for black and brown people are not what they should be. Their cost of living, the cultural context here, nobody wants to put down those kind of roots.
Tabitha Moore is the president of the NAACP in Rutland. She says lots of people these days are choosing not to buy a home, even if they could. During this time of renewed interest around race, it's possible to combine that staycation with education. NBC5's Stuart Ledbetter shows us how.
In the struggle toward that more perfect union, this summer, a new opportunity to learn the stories of black Vermonters who've come before.
As we were forming the trail, I dragged my 3 kids all over the state. So these sites are kid tested for families, and it's a fantastic experience.
Curtis Reed of Brattleboro founded Vermont's African American Heritage Trail. While designed to help attract tourists of color here, it also gives residents new insights into their state.
Oh, my poor Nellie Gray, they have taken you away.
One stop takes us to Grafton, population 670.
It's a little town with a big story,
where visitors learn about former slave Alec Turner.
My grandfather was a big man, 6'3", 235.
Turner and his wife Sally settled here in 1873, built their home, supported the church, and raised 13 children just after the Civil War.
It appears that they meshed in really well, partially because it could be about the power of their character. So Alec appears to be a very charming person, and so people talk about him like he's everybody's friend.
It's one of almost 24 historic sites and markers scattered all over this little state. Like the River Street Cemetery in Woodstock, where black soldiers who fought and died for the Union in the Civil War are buried. To Wolcott, where the Reverend George S. Brown became Vermont's first black Methodist minister. To Colchester, where the Army's Buffalo Soldiers lived at 40th and Allen at the start of the 20th century and opened a lot of local eyes in the process. In Ferrisburg,
we're in what we call the backyard.
The trail stops at Rokeby Museum, a site along the Underground Railroad and now a National Historic Landmark.
And racial justice was a concern for Rowland and Rachel Robinson until their deaths.
The farmstead on Route 7 was home to abolitionists who welcomed escaped slaves fleeing north to Canada. Through documents and photos, piecing together real stories of those who risked everything to get here.
In the context of Black Lives Matter, Black history matters.
And for today's residents, black and white, Reed says, a day on the trail is time well spent.
These are Vermonters who wanted to make Vermont a better place for everyone.
In Grafton, Stuart Ledbetter, NBC5 News.
An Essex teenager is working to keep up the momentum in the fight for racial justice.
As NBC5's Jackie Pascal shows us, the high schooler is providing the resources for you each and every day.
Tilly Krishna is 16.
I get most of my information on Instagram.
Seeing a trend pop up on her social media lately.
Everyone's like really like riled up right now, and like people like want to be doing stuff, but there's not like this book where it's like, oh, here's everything you can do.
So the high schooler created a calendar, each day presenting a different educational resource to watch or read or cause to donate to.
I handpicked them. Specifically, a lot of them have to do with like helping Black lives thrive. It should take you max like 20 minutes, so it's very easy.
Her June edition picking up a lot of traction, leaving many wondering, what about next month?
It felt a little hypocritical for me to just stop there, you know, because I'm talking about like how this movement is like a long-term thing.
So she filled another anti-racism calendar with the goal of her friends and anyone else following her daily assignments to continue thinking about racial justice.
You don't just think about it like the week after George Floyd was murdered. You think about it all the time, because that's the life that Black people are living.
In Essex, Jackie Pascal, NBC5 News.
First one. Correct.
As Tim Curran cracks a new beer that Upper Pass Brewing Company just made,
It's Black is Beautiful.
he's hoping the dark, rich Imperial Stout can make a difference.
It's for a really good cause, and we've got the space, the time, and the incentive.
More than 1,000 craft breweries across the globe are making Black is Beautiful and donating proceeds to local groups that support police brutality reform, as well as equity and inclusion. 7 Vermont spots are in on the campaign, including the famed Alchemist Brewing Company in Stowe. They're set to put the final touches on a batch Thursday, hoping to raise $7,000 for the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance.
We're committed to racial justice, not just making this beer and donating this money, but really for the long term.
A Texas brewery started the initiative. A website includes a starter kit like the packaging label and a recipe, but brewers are encouraged to put their own spin on it. Upper Pass is using local coffee and real Vermont maple syrup.
Yeah, it's gonna be pretty tasty.
Making this a home brew and a cheers for change. In Tunbridge, Tom Garris, NBC5 News.
More often than not, especially in 2020, sports reflect our reality. According to the last U.S. Census, the population of Vermont is 94.2% white, a statistic that is reflected in local sports leadership, making the voices of people of color that much more important. In the entire state of Vermont, there are only 2 Black high school athletic directors.
There's a lack of diversity within our group, but also you see it in our faculty as well, too, and across the state of Vermont.
How the population is, you know, we alluded to it earlier, Vermont is, 95%, white, and, so you don't get those opportunities to, be a part of a diverse culture.
Mike Jabor now works at his alma mater. A former South Burlington High School football standout, he used to keep his feelings of oppression from racism pushed under his pads.
Mike Jabor on a 90-yard touchdown run.
I try to just block it out as much as I can and just say, oh, they're not judging me on the color of my skin, or they're not making decisions based on the color of my skin or anything like that. But I know it was probably there, but I tried my best to kind of shield myself from that and kind of be oblivious to it a little bit.
Karan Pinkney, on the other hand, is from the Bronx. He did not call Vermont home until he put on the purple and gold for St. Michael's basketball.
When I had my freshman orientation, I actually lied to a lot of people and told them I did not play basketball when they asked, because I wanted them to accept me for who I was as a person and not, necessarily go right to that stereotype.
Today, the conversation on racial injustice is on the forefront of most American minds. Their position as Black role models is being spotlighted now more than ever.
Particularly for me and Mike, it's really given us an opportunity to have our voices be heard. As the only 2 Black athletic directors, I think it has opened up a conversation and opened up a dialogue that a lot of people may not have necessarily been open to before.
To me, it doesn't really matter what the color of your skin is. Obviously the students of color do gravitate towards me, and I try to be a role model to them and say that, yeah, I'm a person of color, I'm a Black man, and this could be you.
Mike and Karan are doing everything they can, but they are just 2 people.
We need more leaders for these students that look like them. You know, we need to work together no matter what race is a part of the conversation to develop a society where we're anti-racist.
Mike and Karan would go on to tell me that a pressing issue in the Vermont high school athletic community is the lack of black head coaches, and that is the responsibility of all athletic directors to find a solution to this problem. For the Sports Desk, I'm Marshall Kramsky.